Okay. I'd like to welcome everyone to Csaaw. Enjoy the meal. If you're joining us by video, you can't do that, but you can enjoy the presentation today by June An, who's a second-year PhD student in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. The talk today is on absenteeism, formal models of absenteeism, kind of an organizational behavior problem.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is. Thank you for introducing me. My name is Jun. I'm from Civil Engineering Department, and actually I had to change my affiliation because I just passed the preliminary exam 2 weeks ago, and now I'm PhD candidate. I'm pre-candidate. All right, the title of today's presentation is on agent-based model of workers' absence behavior with regard to group note. In order not to lead you to any misunderstanding of this model, by no means this is a completed work, but it is ongoing development, agent-based modeling work that is a part of my PhD research. As I just said, this is a part of my research, so I think a few slides later, I will have the chance to give you the overview of my PhD research too, or your help. So I will start with introducing some of the background of my research, and then I'll try myself to go into the modeling approach as soon as possible because this is a CISO meeting, so I guess many of you may not be that interested in what's going on in the construction industry. So I will focus this presentation on the perspective of how I decided to go into this direction, go in this approach in agent-based modeling. And I will give you some preliminary simulation results that I wanted to share and discuss. Briefly, I want to talk a little about how I was motivated to study absenteeism issue in construction industry. There were a few research papers that pointed out absenteeism can adversely affect every perspective of construction industry. The reason is simple. Most of the operations have not yet been mechanized in construction industry. Most of operations are still done by a workforce, human beings. So if a human being, if the worker is absent, and then that work that was assigned, that was supposed to be done that day, cannot be carried out. That's just a simple reason. And as shown here, absenteeism has been found to affect low morale, interruption of workflow, alterations in planning, an increased need of overtime, so forth. So we can see that the absenteeism of construction workers can affect very adversely to the performance of construction projects. And then, even though it's a rather old data, in 1985, Hintz and his colleagues estimated over $26 billion per year over the United States occurred due to the loss of productivity caused by absenteeism. And more recently, Hanna and his colleagues found out that 24% and 13% of the productivity loss occurred when the absenteeism is between 6 to 10% and greater than 10%. This may seem odd, like 24% loss of productivity happened when absenteeism was between 6 to 10%. But little less productivity loss actually occurred when absenteeism went even higher. So the authors were also wondering why this result came out, but their interpretation of this result was when the absenteeism went up over a certain tolerable level, managers do some actions very quickly to respond to it, and then come up with a better, like more sort of aggressive idea. Yeah.
So between 10% and 100% absenteeism accounts for only 13% of the total costs due to absenteeism?
So here, okay, so they had a framework to calculate the 100% productivity, and then based on their way of calculation, the productivity, it's kind of standard. And then they surveyed many projects. And then they surveyed the productivity loss and the absenteeism rate. And they averaged the correlation between the absenteeism rate and the productivity loss. That's how they calculated this. So the next, the more motivation that got me into this agent-based modeling to research this absenteeism behavior in construction industry was about absence culture. If there is no culture or if there is no interaction, we don't need to actually adopt as agent-based modeling or simulation research methodology. That's as far as I understand, that's the core part of the idea of using agent-based modeling. And interestingly, many absence literature, they call themselves the absenteeism or absence researchers. Absence literature found out that there is a strong notion of susceptibility of workers to the social controls, which means they look at each other, they learn how to behave in terms of absence, like the absence behavior. I think that may be universal to any other kind of organizational behavior of workers. And then by no means, I guess, it is only limited to the construction industry. Maybe all other industry have this kind of feature too. But since I'm a student in the civil engineering department, so I was motivated like this way. I found that there is a problem caused by absenteeism, and I read a lot of literature about absenteeism, and then I found that there is a cultural effect. That's what brought me to the CISO meeting, ultimately. So here, Johnson and Nicholson, in 1982, in this very well-known paper in absenteeism research, they defined absence culture as the set of shared understanding about absence legitimacy in a given organization, and they established customs and practices of employee attendance, absence behavior, and its control. So within this background in mind, I set an objective of this research as to understand how the individual level absence behavior of construction workers and the organization level absence culture interrelated and evolve over time. Because before workers started to work at a job site, we can think that there is no culture, because there can be no culture before the people's existence, right? So people are hired and started to work together, and then the other people can call some kind of entity in that organization as a culture at that job site. So I thought there should be an interrelation between these individual level characteristics or behavior and the organizational level, or just the work group level. The group level, individual level characteristics, I thought should have some kind of interrelation between them. Maybe kind of feedback relationships. And as many absenteeism researchers pointed out, what is lacking in the absence researcher previously, the research efforts previously was they used to mostly rely on the survey methodology. So they just survey what's the organizational level characteristic, or in the other many times they also just try to investigate what's the individual level characteristic. That is the main causes of absenteeism. But there is no such investigation of what's the interaction, like what's the relationship between these two levels, individual level, cultural level. So as I said, before the people are actually hired and started to work together, there should be no culture in that site. And that culture, once it started to exist, once it started to be present, it should exert on the workers' behavior. That's a basic assumption.
Did you assume anything about the individual's behaviors? Like some people might be more prone to absenteeism.
Sure,
than other
sure.
people.
So at this level, I approach that issue, that like heterogeneity of workers, by setting some of the parameters like as uniform distribution, something like that, because I don't have yet like sufficient data that I collected from real site. So once I get the data of real distribution, I think I can use that data. But at this point, I don't have that data, so I just make the assumption and just test some hypothesis by just setting the uniform distribution for some of the characteristic parameters that I thought to be critical parameters to in this organizational behavior. So the research scope here is actually a research scope of my whole entire PhD research. I have already been working on this absence behavior research, and then there has been the many researchers pointed out that withdrawal behavior, which includes absence and lateness, turnover, all these kind of so-called withdrawal behavior have a common characteristic. So I think once I have a in-depth understanding about absence behavior, and then I think I can possibly extend the idea to cover up to all kinds of withdrawal behavior. And if it turns out successful, I think I hope to extend the scope of the model even further to cover general cultural behavior of construction workers. That's my goal. So let's go into the modeling approach. This is also the research framework of my entire PhD study. Here I didn't specify what kind of simulation model that I'm going to use, because agent-based modeling actually is not only one modeling approach that I take. I also use the system dynamics approach. It may sound odd because it's a kind of new approach that I'm suggesting. Agent-based modeling and system dynamics modeling methodology have been explained to have common features in terms of explaining complex behavior of a system. But the approach is pretty different. Agent-based modeling, you model the agent's behavior, which means you only design what's the behavior rule at the agent level. And then you understand the system level phenomena as an emergent behavior out of the rules that you set. And in the system dynamics, on the other hand, you design directly what's the relation between system level properties. Like, for example, like an agent-based model, you design what's the behavior rule of each worker, right? When they observe others, how largely they will be affected by others' behavior, something like that. That's the rule that I design in agent-based model. On the other hand, in system dynamics, I would rather have to design what's the relation between system property, such as relation between absenteeism average and then their willingness to follow others' absenteeism behavior, something like that, as in the organization level. So I try to combine those two approaches. I think because it is often called system dynamics has a top-down approach, and agent-based modeling has a bottom-up approach. And I think there should be a very productive effect if I can model same system behavior in these two different approaches. And then my suggestion is that in that process, to try to model same behavior in these two directions may educate each other. So in agent-based model, you can learn something, and then you take that knowledge that you learn from the agent-based model to model some relation between system parameters in system dynamics. then you also, because system dynamics, you are forced to think as in like systems thinking. What's the relation between the system level parameters? By testing the system level parameters, you may have a better idea what you might want to also include in the agent-based model perspective, something like that. So I'm not very sure what I will find out in this endeavor, but I'm hoping for finding some interesting relation in terms of process, modeling process. So just to not to lead you to any misunderstanding, this is different from some hybrid simulation model. That means the integration of the final product of modeling. But I'm more interested in what can be the collaborative kind of effect in terms of the process of modeling process. So this is the modeling approach. As I say, the agent-based modeling has been known as effective to model cross-level that I like to call the cross-level relation. There are certain organizational level properties or some parameters. And then this level, all those charts, all those diagrams up to this level means group level properties, and this level means individual level. Let me explain from here. Let's say somehow by some mechanism, an individual worker decided to be absent on that day for some reason. And that behavior could be observed by others via some network in that organization. And in that organization, the network can be seen as a communication connection, or just simply how many people they can observe, how big portion of the people each worker can observe and can be affected by, something like that. And then via this network, and then some interaction, system patterns can emerge, which can be related to this absence norm. I think I missed this part. Okay, so I have explained mostly about like what's the organizational perspective that I would like to investigate in studying construction, in the organizational behavior and construction project. But particularly, I am focusing on this existence of norm as a social control. So the system patterns can be seen as a mechanism to generate this kind of absence norm in this organization. So here, each organization, I suppose, have two control systems. One is formal, and the other is a social control system. And then informal standard is that social control mechanism, which is absence norm. And the formal standard is what is written in the rule book and or contract, or the policy, the project policy or company policy. I think each individual worker can perceive what's the formal rule and social rule in the organization. And I guess each worker has to be affected by these two standards in the formation of personal standard, which means what is the legitimacy in their behavior? What is the legitimate level of their behavior? Here is here about absenteeism. And I think each individual worker may have some different characteristic, different disposition, or some characteristic related to following these two rules. Some workers might have more inclination to observe others more, like learn by watching others more. Or some other workers may have more stronger kind of inclination to just stick to what is written on the rule book, and then just to not to violate any of the formal rules. So I designed that each individual has two characteristics which are critical individual characteristic in the formation of their own personal standard regarding absence behavior. And once they form their own personal standard, as in the control theory, they behave according to their standard. That's one of the assumptions in this modeling work. So let me, yeah.
So empirically, does the literature find that there's heterogeneity in worksite absenteeism, or is there kind of convergence that, like, over time, work sites tend to converge to the same level of absenteeism?
Yeah, there has been some empirical findings that. Okay, I think that you have two parts in your question. So one is how, like, if there was evidence that actually the heterogeneity among workers reduces, like, and it converges into one uniform kind of behavior. Is it?
So I'm just wondering if you see that all work sites tend to behave the same regarding absenteeism,
okay.
that there's kind of a consistent dynamic that emerges,
Mm-hmm.
Or is there a lot of heterogeneity indicating that small variations in behavior and norms have larger variations in overall absenteeism in a particular work site?
So this may help you to understand. So these researchers have found that absence behavior is consistent within a unit, but significantly different across units. That's what they found, and that's where they think that this may be the apparent evidence of the existence of absence culture that evolves during their work time.
June, just to push on that a little more, when they talk about units here, what do they mean by a unit? Is that a company or is that a work group?
No, it's mostly most of the cases they mean the unit by, like, work group level, where each worker can communicate a lot. They understand each other, and then they essentially, like, affect each other's behavior.
Okay.
So I can say, because as I just answered to Jin's question several minutes ago, I don't have sufficient data that I collected, that I'm planning to collect possibly this summer or the fall. So I had to depend on the mostly theoretical and empirical findings that has been reported in the literature to make up the model. So I read a lot of literature, and then I came up with these 4 model components to come up with a more specific agent behavior rules. So the model component 1 can be told like this: when a worker perceives that he or she has been absent fewer times than his or her personal standard, the worker's absence-taking probability gets higher, which is nothing but just a control theory. And there has been considerable amount of evidence that each human being has a sort of a control theory in controlling their own behavior, both in their work organization context or just in our normal life. So that's the first model component that I have in my agent-based model. Then the model component 2 is that a worker's personal absence standard is determined based on the formal standard and social standard, as I just explained in the last slide. And what I wanted to emphasize is that they might have to decide which control mechanism they are more affected by. And then, as you just raised the question, I think that characteristic may differ the person to person. So that's why I had to come up with this variable conformity, which means particularly the attitude toward the formal rule in favor of formal rule in deciding their behavior. And the modal component 3 is that a worker looks at others' absence behavior, interprets the observed information, and internalize the observed absence as the perceived absence norm. And this process can be reinforced even further by the salience of that absence norm. Here, the absence norm, the observed absence norm is how the observed information has uniformity among them. So, for example, if you find out that in your work group, every worker's absence-related behavior doesn't have any commonality, and then you may not consider it as an absence norm. But if you find out that all the members in your work group have a very same pattern in their absence behavior, you may have to feel that that's the absence norm in our work group. That's the notion of the salience of absence norm. And also here, I had to also come up with another variable to define how likely they will be willing to follow others' standard, like by observing others. Like once they collect some information by watching others and observing others, people may have different tendency to follow the observed information taken as norm. So people may just want to keep their own way, even though they have watched many cases that the work group has a strong absence norm, something like that. But some other people may be very sensitive to others' behavior and have a very strong kind of attitude to follow others' standards, not to violate others' feeling or something. So modal component 4 is a worker can observe the absence behavior of a portion of coworkers, not the entire population in the organization. And so the 4 modal components are basically designed, or I would rather say translated, from what has been found from empirical findings and theoretical findings from the absence literature. So this is the flow chart of behavior rules of agents. This is exactly same. This flow has exactly same sequence of making an absence behavior. They observe others, and then they interpret others' behavior. And I found that in this step is subject to bias in interpretation of others' behavior, which is also found from the absence literature. And then this interpreted others' behavior can be captured and affect one's perceiving of the norm. And here, susceptibility, which is the one's characteristic, individual attitude, and the salience, which means how strong the absence norm has been observed. And by having these two standards, this is a formal standard and this is informal standard, a person decides what's the personal standard related to absence behavior. And in this step, the conformity, which means comparingly how much the person would like to take the formal rule over the social rule, if there is any discrepancy between them. And once they have a personal standard and then they behave according to the standard, that's the behavior rules that I designed. Once again, I have been trying to come up with these old rules from the findings from the literature. And then I did my best to translate these all 4. Okay, here I numbered 1, 2, 3, 4 step, and then I named this 0. And these equations are made to address each step. And the step number one, like equation one, only equation number one includes the step 0 and 1 in the flow chart that I showed in the last slide. So this each equation is made to reflect what was described as a behavior rule in each step, and I translated them into these equations. I think this is intuitive. This is basically just average, weighted average, and this is, as I said, the person has these two. The person in the formation of personal standard, a worker is affected by this small s, means susceptibility, which is individual characteristic, and the salience, which is about how uniform the observed data, how uniformly the observed data is distributed. And then operationally, I had to limit the large S up to 10 because I defined it as a standard the inverse of standard deviation, and when it goes too little, when it becomes too small, I found that the S dominates the whole behavior. So I had to I tested actually what would be the reasonable kind of limit of this variable, and then I found like 10 maybe is reasonable, and it doesn't hurt the whole organizational behavior in my perspective. And here in this step, personal standard, the final personal standard of absenteeism, in terms of absenteeism, is decided by comparison these two control, the formal control and social control. That was taken from this equation. And then according to this standard and the recent behavior history of that person, the person would compare what has been the recent history of absence that himself or herself, and then what is the personal standard. And then when the person figures out the one has been absent more times than his or her own personal standard, he or she might want to be a lot more cautious because he or she found out already has been going pretty bad in terms of the behavior. So that's one of the assumptions that I had, which is from the control theory.
Jim, just one question. I don't understand large S sub I and why that should be a standard deviation.
So
Can you explain that again?
Sure. So this is okay. The concept is that if you are more susceptible to others' behavior, like in deciding what's the legitimate level of absence, the susceptibility, small s, is the individual characteristic, individual attitude, and the large S is that how uniformly your observed data are distributed. So let's say you watch it like 10 other workers who are in your group team, who are in your group, the work team, and then you found that all those 10 workers' absence, like a mean behavior, are exactly same. There is no standard deviation, and then you should find out that that is not governed by the individual whole characteristic, but there should be a kind of a driver that make the total behavior as that like converged into one value.
So people are socially more susceptible when everyone else is exactly the same.
Exactly. That's the concept of salience of
Okay.
norm. Sorry about this. Okay, so
Could you say again why you limited that to 10?
So here, since I defined the large S salience as the inverse of standard deviation, when they do not have any standard, when they have exactly the same way, the standard deviation goes to 0, and then largest goes to like a
Yeah.
So with this model, I did some experiments. So these are the inputs for my age-based model, and I would like to just explain a little bit for these three variables because I think those are the important ones. So conformity settings, susceptibility settings, as I said, to have a sense of heterogeneity of workers, I set them as uniform distribution. And you might wonder where these numbers come from. So conformity setting 0.1 to 0.5 means that if you have conformity 0.5, whenever you compare the social rule and the formal rule, you have a 50-50 kind of percent chance that you follow the formal rule, either social rule. The less the value is, you more inclined to follow the social rule, which was formed by your observation. And then here, the susceptibility setting, this was defined by how much each worker is affected by others' behavior each day. So 0.01 means that you may take 100 days to set your personal standard exactly same as what you have observed. That is what the number means here. So I set these numbers like as this distribution. And for your information, I found that these numbers have practically in the simulation results, they make the simulation results as workers are very, how I say, they are very cautious. They are very sensitive to both social rules and formal rules. These numbers practically have that kind of sense in terms of the simulation results. And the probability function here is suggested as a step function, which I thought that I could come up with as most simple, like a simplified version. So 5% means when they have found that they have already had more absence case than their personal standard, they have found 5% of another absence taking decision, something like that. And when they have, when they feel themselves have a 1 day sort of margin, like when they found that they will be still okay if they can make another day of absence, and then they have 10%. And then when it is larger, like 3 days larger than their standard, and then they are likely just 90% of absence. That's I understand that that's a strong assumption which comes from control theory to understand their decision process of their behavior. So basically, I conducted 2 experiments, and I presented 2 kinds of experiment results. One is just a single run data, and the second is a sensitivity analysis. As you can see here, single run data. Oh, I think I forgot here what was the intention for these variables. Here, I said 100 workers, 10 crews. So each crew has about 10 workers. And the formal standard was 1 day. So which means the formal organization just allows you to be absent only 1 day a month. And the initial personal standard was set as also uniform distribution from 1 to 5 days, which means kind of problematic situation. Even the formal standard is set to be just 1 day, and then people think that they'll be all right if they just even if they are absent like 3 or 4 days in a month, something like that. So this is what I intended to simulate. Yeah.
The memory capacity on the 30. So how do they store? Do they have like an average memory of like the average days of absence for their friends on each of the past 30 days?
This was implemented by just hard coding that each worker to have just 30 days of memory. So each worker has an array to represent their memory. So 30 days and then after the 30 days, when the new information comes in, and the oldest one just get out. That's.
But what information, like what is stored in each like member of? So what, like the array would be like numbers from 0 to what, and what would those?
Oh yeah, that memory capacity is about the memory of others' absence rate.
Okay.
So in each array, like in each element in an array, the data of how much the other workers have been absent monthly is stored. So in this setting, with this setting, I ran a single run simulation, and as you can see here, this gray line represent how their perception, I mean, like their personal standard, averagely changed over time, and then this the darker line represent what is the average behavior, absence behavior in the group of 100 workers and 10 crews. Here, as I mentioned, I set as initial value, they have a very problematic kind of perception, and then by those combinatorial effect among high susceptibility and high conformity, and also very strict control system, the average absence behavior as well as their average personal standard go down up to like 1.5 or 1.3 days, which I found is kind of plateau. It's kind of a limit that can be lowered. And then at the same time, the distribution of their perception, has been shaped like they has been changed like in this way. They have more uniform. First time they had a more uniform distribution, and as time goes by, they have more convergent kind of a perception about the legitimate level of absence. So I think that this simulation result shows me that how a norm could emerge via the interactions among workers, and also how that interaction exert the open workers' behavior, and these two levels interact each other, and not only one way, but those two by the round ways, the interaction create a norm, and the norm once again exert upon workers, and this dynamicism created by this feedback kind of relationship might make this interesting absence-related behavior at the organizational level. That's what I found from this single-run simulation. And this one is a sensitivity analysis that I conducted for those two variables, because as I introduced, susceptibility conformity were designed as the individual's characteristic, how much they are, how much about their attitude. So these are the characteristic variable of each worker to represent their attitude toward formal rule or social rule. And I found that when, so I tried to interpret this result of simulation, and then I found that the susceptibility may be seen as a reinforcing driver to make the workers to not to be absent more quickly and more economically. Because you can see here, conformity, of course, affects a lot in terms of this absence behavior. When the conformity goes higher, workers tend to be more like less times, absent more less times. And then, even though when the conformity was set like in this same value, 0.28, which is not very high, which means workers of course, look at the formal rule, but they also are very much affected by the social rule. And then where they have more susceptibility, their absence behavior was pretty low. But when they have low susceptibility, which means they don't really care about the social rule, social norm in the group, the organization level absence was pretty high. Even the conformity was about same in the group. So I think this may be able to give you the insight that conformity, I think that conformity can be changed by the investment of mostly by investment of the work organization. So to change the overall level of workers' conformity, you may have to suggest more kind of reward for the workers who are not very absent, or they may have to come up with more like penalties to penalize the workers who misbehave, something like that. So I think the conformity can be seen as changed by the mostly work organization's formal action. And susceptibility, if susceptibility can be also stimulated by some managerial action, and if that can be somehow like change it like into this higher susceptibility direction, I guess even like a low conformity, which I would like to translate it into kind of less level of like a low level of investment of formal rules, still can be very effective, because the formal rules would just create kind of attraction, like where the whole organization wants workers to get close, like just to create the direction or objective, and then the conformity can just operate this for that purpose. And if somehow the work organization can stimulate and then encourage workers, like create a kind of culture to the kind of autonomously kind of look at each other and evaluate each other, that may be as effective as very high formal rules. So that's what I think are very interesting. So I think I have already told you pretty much like preliminary findings that I thought myself that I could find from those simulation results. And these are a lot of challenges. I have to consider that still there are a lot to do. First, the point of view is, of course, the collecting data and how I can validate this idea with the real data that I get from the real construction site. And one of the most significant challenge that I'm now facing is how I can measure the susceptibility and conformity level. Because I had a chance to survey some of the construction workers in the last summer in Canada, and when I asked the question, because I was not like in terms of the development of the survey, I think I was not like my skill was not very sophisticated. So just I asked them like how much they feel they are affected by formal rule, kind of this kind of way, and they felt it's really difficult to really say why they behave like in that way, something like that. So I think I need to develop a very sophisticated way to really measure why they behave like that, even though they cannot really answer the question, because they might not be really aware of why they behave like that. They just behave. When I ask the question, you really learn how to behave by watching others? They say yes, of course. And when I ask them, are you aware of specific rules, like in terms of absenteeism and other productivity and other behavioral standard? They say, of course. And then they like a lot of them just marked like 7, which is like the largest scale. So I was very frustrated. So I now think that I need to find out a better way to measure what's the susceptibility, which I define actually for my research purpose. Susceptibility and conformity, which I think it should be pretty critical kind of factor in work organization, because I think it's kind of intuitive. Work organization should have a kind of formal rule and social rule, and they must learn how to behave by being affected by these two rules somehow. So I would like to measure, because already I have modeled those two characteristics of individual attitude as critical factors. So I really would like to measure that data, and I'm not very this time that is not very clear how I can do that. And there are lots of criticism that can be raised, I know, like about the behavior rules, how much those behavior rules are validated, basically. And I found that the behavior rule that I have at hand in my current agent-based model can be seen as a model of sense-making of workers. Workers who should like to understand what's going on in that work organization, and then they should have some kind of mind to make sense out of it, including their own actions. So I think the behavior rules of agent model in this particular case of my research can be seen how workers would make sense out of their environment, their work circumstances, and also in deciding how to behave. So I'm now studying how workers, like how people make sense, or what's the method of people to make sense in work organizations. I guess like if I have more understanding of how people make sense in organizations, that can definitely help in designing better agent-based model, behavior rules of agent in my agent-based model. I guess I think I made a little longer presentation than I thought would be, that I expected, or that you expected. And I'm sorry about that, and that's all. Thank you very much.
I make a prediction that if you ask the workers, do you like your boss, it's going to tell you a lot about conformity.
Okay. That sounds very positive.
On your survey the last time around, did you ask them about not just where do you get your information, but how often do you think most people in your group are absent? Did you ask them that question? Because that's something you have a parameter for immediately in your model, and you can tie that to data right away.
So you mean like questions about main causes?
No, not about cause. Just say, look, think about your work group. On average, how many days do you think people in that group missed last month?
Okay, so I think I can answer the question in this way. So before I took that survey by myself, my advisor actually was leading a project which was held in Canada when he was teaching there. So that was his first project to, asking them how they interpret others' absence behavior. And then definitely the question includes your question, like how many times you think that other actually have been absent, something like that. And they found that their kind of exaggeration of others' absence behavior was 2.5 times.
Conformity seems like you mentioned conformity also with regards to the punishment companies, the harsh punishment.
Sure, yeah, that's really.
And also the economic situation. So the conformity, you think you're going to lose your job, you can't find another one.
Right. Yeah. Of course, yeah. The economic environment should affect their attitude, of course. Not only what the work organization do over the workers. Yeah. Yeah.
If you were to take one organization and look at the distribution of absentee rates, is that typically normally distributed, and how does it relate to the formal rule?
That's a great question, because it depends on what kind of crew, like a work group, you look at. So I found that some of the work group, for example, have like 2 workers who make the most of the problem, related to absenteeism, and then the others are just all fine. So the distribution wouldn't look very much like the normal distribution, I guess. So that's another challenge, that at the once I really get the data, because at that time I didn't really collect what's the absence data. But I just asked the managers, like, what were their impression, and then they say like maybe 1 or 2 among the workers may make most of the problem, and then the others are just fine, something like that. So it might not be the normal distribution, I guess.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in the shape, and then also whether it's centered around the formal rule, or maybe it's centered around something higher or lower. That's a
That's
social norm.
definitely a good way to measure or try to interpret. I try to understand what's the mechanism behind it.
I just wanted to hear again something you said. Did the individual workers have 2.5 times the perceived absent rate as
That was
compared to
what
the
was
real?
surveyed about a year ago.
Wow.
2.5 times. And then it was not the first time actually reported that the workers tend to exaggerate others' behavior quite as much. So at least 2 times. There were several, actually not one, just several.
Yeah, that's just interesting that their perception. I mean, it's in the direction that they would want it, but nevertheless, that's large.
Is it the direction that? Maybe I misunderstood. I thought you were saying, on average, people miss 1 day per month, but I think that everybody misses 2.5 days.
Yeah, something like that.
They-
Yeah, that,
want
I
everybody
think
to
of that
justify
as
their
in
own
the direction they
absentee.
want because they want permission
Oh, it's
to be
they,
absent.
right.
more.
Gotcha. I thought you were taking the manager's perspective.
No, never.
So as I just said many times, it's ongoing. It's in progress. So I think that probably in this semester, I will have to upgrade, lots of perspective in this model that I'm hoping for. So maybe next time, if I have another chance, then I'll be willing to present what's the the upgraded part,
Something for collection of your data that might be interesting is to follow, I don't know how easy it would be to do, but to follow certain workers over time to see where they go, to see how personal variation happens over projects, right? Because that might help you understand your
Sure.
model. Obviously this would be a long time
Sure.
thing, but
I absolutely, because one of the critical difference that I would like to make by having this kind of modeling approach in investigating absence research is the dynamics, is how people actually can change their behavior. Because if there is no change, actually you don't need to actually come up with this dynamic model, because there is just one characteristic, several characteristics which are not supposed to be changed over time. And then you just need to investigate what's their individual or organizational characteristic at one point in time, and then that's all that can explain what's the behavior. But another strong assumption is that should be variable, their behavioral characteristics. That was my assumption, and I really would like to see that's reality, that's really what's happening.
yeah, if you could get the data, I think that'd be really useful for your model, because you would have these points. They would still be pretty sparse, but you could say here's Jean, and these are the relevant factors for when she worked for this company, and now
Sure.
she has a different absentee level, and
Yeah.
there's these different factors.
Sure. What I really need is, I think, it's not really quantitative like a resemblance, but if I can get the idea of what's a pattern of their behavioral change, that may be great. Yeah.
Well, for instance, for the agent-based model, the kind of thing that you could observe that would be hard to observe otherwise is you get a new person in, Jean, who has a high absent rate, and then you get an infection. And that would be hard to get dynamics other than with an agent-based model.
Yeah, I was going to say another place that might be interesting to look for data is after a recent change in policy. How does it readjust? Does the social norm sort of stay fixed, or is there something else
Exactly.
going on? Yeah.
That must be the point that you can actually take some observations, because when the things haven't done really changing much, and then things are really hard to distinguish to be distinguish each other. But when you can really create kind of a stimuli, or if you can observe what was the point that is supposed to, where something's supposed to happen, that may be a very interesting point to observe.
So I have two suggestions for the model. One is, right now you're basing this on control theory, which I think works to a point, but I think when you start to unpack the psychology of work, at least for me, when I've been in jobs where somebody's like looking over my shoulder to see if I show up, a big part of it is there's a threshold and I want to stay above the threshold. If I'm above, then I'm fine, but if I fall below, then I know I need to get up to that point. So
I think it's not very different from the approach that I take, because that's what is about control theory in my model. So once he or she figures out he or she is one of them, she's who is misbehaving, and then he wants to get back to the above the threshold.
But in your model right now, as I understand it, the opposite is also true, where if you're above, then you're likely to start to miss days until you come down to that threshold.
Yeah, that's a part.
So kind of going to Rick's comment about needing the wages, if you imagine that workers are there to make a certain amount of income, it might be that in order for me to make enough income for the job to really be worthwhile, I need to work this many days per month. And so that's going to impose a tighter constraint on me than the work policy or the social group. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I'm not
that
saying
makes
it very
sense.
clearly, but
I think including the other perspective too, that has to be not tested, but that has to be surveyed by really looking at how they work and how they behave.
So that would be my second suggestion, is to specifically build in wages and punishment into the model. And then on your survey, you can ask people, if you didn't come in X days per week, what do you think would happen? Oh, I'd get fired. Or, oh, well, I'd make less money and that would be bad.
Okay.
Because I may be wrong on this, but my best guess is that those are going to be really important kind of mental calculations for the worker.
Okay.
And you might want to do a smaller open-ended survey to get a sense of how to word the thresholds and things, and then launch the more intense survey. Because open-ended surveys are hard to analyze, but they're good because they give you a lot of data.
Okay.
Even when you build
And then one of the suggestion when I presented this research proposal to dissertation committee and then also some other audiences, they also recommended me to try to get some data, for example, from university or something, because the absenteeism can be not only be able to be observed from the work site, but it's a universal kind of behavior. So, in a class situation, you're supposed to attend every class basically, but for some reason you sometimes decide to miss some of the class, and so there's some actually people recommending me to get the data from other circumstances that may help to develop and to make it more robust, the model.
Well, nice national experiment if you can find someplace where people switch work groups.
Switch work groups.
Occasionally.
Yeah.
So, because they have different norms.
Right.
See if they change to go towards the norm that they go.
Because that survey, that kind of circumstance may have some similarity with the construction project.
If you looked at for example, poli-sci grad students in 4 different classes, it's all classes in the same department, but the membership of the classes would be different, so you could see.
I was also thinking that the same framework would be applicable to volunteer groups, and since they usually have different campaigns or different things they do, you can check out how many people want to come.
Right.
And there's also no real penalty for not showing up. So
Right. So it's more like some different kind of organization, right? It's a more autonomously operated and organized kind of organization. So I think there should be definitely some interesting relation between how autonomous the group is actually affect the organizational level behavior, something like that.
And it'd also be interesting to see what would happen if a company, instead of providing a penalty, would provide a reward if a worker got X amount of work done. So you'd have an incentive to come in because you need to finish it. So if you don't reach this threshold, you don't get a bonus.
Well, that is kind of how wages work, right? I mean, you get paid $10 an hour, so you get paid more for showing up more.
Well, I'm talking about a nonlinear type thing. For example, if you complete job X, then bam, there's a bonus. And so a worker will think, oh, I need to finish putting this together.
There's
Something like
to
this.
switch to that.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I can't remember. I heard on NPR there was a company that just switched to, you don't have to be there anymore. You just like are given concrete tasks to accomplish.
Saab in Sweden operates this way. At each stage, you send the thing on. There's no report to the central executive, but if the thing's inadequate at the stage, it goes back to the previous stage to fix it or change it. And this apparently just works wonders. The whole idea that you're going to have to do the job over again is a lot worse than any other.
But unfortunately, Saab just went under. So
Yeah.
it didn't work so well.
Toyota's done this too, though.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I think a lot of places, yeah. One final comment for me, at least. You may want to look, if you haven't, as far as control theory is concerned, at distributed control. It may fit better with what you're trying to do, where the control is distributed and emergent, not imposed, so that the standards impart.
Yeah, speaking of that, another reason why that might be good is because if you have the hard-coded steps for the, if you're under, if you can't miss any more, you're going to miss 5%. Because one thing that's a little tricky about that is that then you get kind of a floor, right, where 5% is the lowest you can go for absenteeism, so that would be 1.5 a month, right? So if the policy is 1 a month, you can't ever actually get down there.
Yeah, that's it.
And just one other place you might look. There's a whole literature on personnel economics. This is run by economists, so it's all about costs and benefits and incentives. But they've thought about these things really carefully, and they have a lot of good models.
Okay.
So Lazar, I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name, but has a really good review book and then a more recent review article on this.
Okay.
It's a good place to start.
Yeah. Can you send the author's name, like
Yeah.
email, and that'll help me great.
Yeah, happy to.
One last comment that I would like to before finishing is the many other audience previously criticized the fact that I didn't actually include the perspective of being sick, because when you are sick, you're just sick. There is nothing you can decide about it, right? And I knew that, my model didn't include that perspective, about being absent. I think that I had had it, wanted to see the absence behavior as to some kind of decision model, but many people argue that this may not be true. So it's as I say here, it's also related to how it makes sense, how people make sense. Once they really understand the person has to be absent, they may have kind of different interpretation, how they might have to follow others' behavior here.
Oh, well, the thing you brought up about being sick, that seems like it also introduces a lot of complications, because if you decide to not be absent when you are sick, then absenteeism might go up the next week because you got your work group sick.
Yeah, it's also possible.
Yeah, indirect effects that could go on.
So, yeah, that's it, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I was a little worried that mine might have been a little too long.
We're fine. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much.